say that Space Invaders is a worldwide phenomenon, might as well just tell everybody that the sky is blue. Since it invaded Japan in 1978, Space Invaders has been brought to every major home console and computer. Sometimes officially, but most of the time not. Inspired by the earlier game Breakout, Space Invaders involves aliens invading from space. Would you believe it? And despite the fact that it's inherently an impossible task, players' job is to stop these aliens in their tracks, using whatever means possible. And that essentially means moving left and right, and firing. Arcade simplicity at its finest. The original game sparked a revolution in arcades across the world, and everyone from the smallest bedroom programmer to the biggest studio wanted a piece of that pie. And the first to officially get hold of it was Atari. The Atari version was many firsts in the industry. It was the first licensed video game, it was the first game to sell over 1 million units, and it's often cited as the first ever killer app. People were so eager to play Space Invaders at home, they went out and bought Ataris just to get their hands on it. It was also the source of the world's first competitive gaming scene, the National Space Invaders competition held in New York, grand prize of which was a tabletop version of Asteroids. Gameplay-wise, the Atari version is surprisingly decent. Some concessions have been made for the slightly less powerful hardware, but overall it is pretty damn faithful to the arcade game. There are less invaders on screen, the layout is slightly different, and they for some reason have made up their own graphics, which are a bit odd. You've got a few aliens that kind of resemble the originals, but I don't get what's going on with this game. I mean, well, he's got feet, but he's floating. Beats me. I'd say it's worth playing for a history lesson, but not for much more, unless of course you're nostalgic for it. In which case, fire away. A modified version of the Atari game was produced for Coca-Cola by Atari themselves. And it's something of a curio. Most of the alien graphics have been replaced with the word Pepsi. Reason being, it's Coke, so they gotta shoot down Pepsi, because Pepsi apparently have access to space alien technology. The UFO has been replaced with a Pepsi logo, and instead of lives you've got 3 minutes to score as many points as you can. The aliens have no way of getting to the bottom, so you can't lose, and what happens when you run out of time? Coke wins. Every time. I bet the people who came up with this game thought they were really clever. Pepsi Invaders is one of the rarest games ever produced. Only 125 copies were ever made, and they were only given to Coca-Cola executives at an event. They were produced on completely plain black cartridges, and while repros exist, getting a hold of an original, well, it may be rare, but it's no Akalabath, is it? So the home version was exploding. But in the arcades, it was a totally different story. Space Invaders have been all but supplanted by games such as Galaxian, Defender, Galaga, and while they attempted to fight back with Space Invaders Part 2, it didn't really go so well, considering it was essentially the same game again. Taito really needed to get their act together. So in 1985, the Invaders returned in Return of the Invaders. And it's pretty much the same game, more or less. They do vary the Invaders' patterns and logic every once in a while, but mostly they stick to the old rank and file of the original games. The graphics are clearly technically improved, but the aesthetic doesn't really suit to me, and the music is way too slow and chill. Whereas the original inspired panic and tension, this one makes you feel like you're floating around in dreamland. It's very strange. Also, what's with these enemies? Half of them are babies, half of them look like internal organs. It's all a bit bizarre, really. Don't know what they were thinking with this one. Well, I do know what they were thinking, they just wanted to get back in the game. And I don't know if they were successful with that. But they kept making Space Invaders games, so there must have been something there. There was never an official home port for Return of the Invaders back in the day, but the game we got 5 years later? That's another story entirely. Super Space Invaders feels like what they should have done with Return. It features updated graphics, in a more consistent art style, and it introduces a few extra twists to the gameplay that you perhaps wouldn't expect from a Space Invaders game. The aliens sometimes respond differently when you shoot them. For example, in this stage they grow, which makes things really damn difficult. Sometimes they do a bit of dancing, like in Return, and sometimes there's bosses. What more do you want? There's even a simultaneous 2-player mode. Oh, and there's this weird cattle mutilation stage that feels like Missile Command and Defender had a bit of a freaky evening. Now this is only the arcade version, but this game was brought to a variety of systems that were around in the 90s. Amiga, Atari ST, MS-DOS, as well as a few 8-bits like the C64 and even the Speccy, but ironically not the Super Nintendo. Let's take a look at a few, shall we? They seem to have invented their own storyline for the game in this one, in which the old Space Invaders cabinets get chucked out into space and therefore get picked up by all the aliens that then come and invade, making it a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Also, who's this Toshiro Nishikado guy? Pretty sure his name's Tomohiro, isn't it? The actual game itself is essentially the same thing. They have made a few graphical improvements over the arcade version. For example, the wide aliens now have unique graphics. Unfortunately they're not animated, so it does look a bit weird. Otherwise, it is basically the same thing. Only problem is, the ship is really hard to control. Feels like it's on ice, so I perhaps wouldn't recommend this version. On a similar note, the ZX Spectrum version isn't really worth playing as an actual game, but I'd say it's worth at least a cursory glance. It's a very impressive port for the old system. It is surprisingly faithful to the arcade game in a world where arcade perfect ports were few and far between. This one does a pretty good job. I guess they figured they couldn't put a game with Super in the title on the Mega Drive, so they just made an entirely new game instead. It's a pretty decent version of Space Invaders, if a Mega Drive's all you've got. It does feel very much like Super, but it's not got quite as many features in it. I didn't see any circular dancing aliens, for example, and I didn't really see any boss battles either. Then again, I didn't get very far in it, so maybe that stuff appears later on, because it is quite a difficult game. Whereas all the other Invaders games have been in portrait, this one's in landscape, meaning the Invaders don't have to travel as far to get to the bottom. And the bullets don't take as long to reach you, which means you get hit all the time. It's a good thing you got a shield, but it doesn't really last very long. However, there are some power-ups that can help that come from the UFOs, much like what Super and Return both did. There's this strange holojuke type power-up, which spawns 2 other ships that fire simultaneously. Pretty useful. Also this giant laser, which is very satisfying to use. And the enemy phalanxes do change it up a bit. They tend to stay in the same rank and file, but they do move around differently in each stage. Sometimes the top half moves independently from the bottom half, which is really difficult to deal with. And sometimes there's these giant rocks in the way. Shoot them down and they don't let you move past. Don't know what that's all about. One thing I will mention is the soundtrack. Sounds like Yes or Genesis. It's pretty cool. Graphics are very impressive as well. Backgrounds are really nicely done. Only problem is the foreground graphics do tend to get lost on them. You can't really tell where your ship is, for example, when you're on Earth. Overall, I'd say give it a go if you have a Mega Drive. But otherwise, I'd still say go for Super at this point. By this point, Space Invaders has been around for 13 years, so Taito decided it was time to bring it back, to both the arcade and to consoles, with Space Invaders DX. And after a drawn-out title screen saying that Space Invaders had a great vogue in 1978, not that that makes a lick of sense, you get a choice from 4 different versions of the original game, including the upright cabinet with the moon background, the colour cocktail version, the black and white cocktail version, and the cellophane cocktail version. Quite why you'd want to play that, I have no idea, but nostalgia is a strange thing. You also get this weird parody mode that takes graphics from other Taito games and sticks it into the Space Invaders formula. Don't know how well it works really, but it's there, so I thought I'd better at least mention it. So this is, for all intents and purposes, Space Invaders. That's all it is, it's just the original game. It's nice that you get a selection of versions to play, but the upright version is a little gnarly, shall we say. The graphics technology wasn't quite good enough to render the physical moon and space background that was on the original cabinet. You also don't get to pick part 2, which is interesting, though as we've mentioned before it was essentially the same game, so you're perhaps not missing out on very much. Otherwise, you know, it's the same game we all know and love. Nothing wrong with that. And this would turn out to be the model for loads of different Space Invaders releases over the next few years, including the Super Famicom release of Space Invaders, the original game. Guess they'd already used the name Super Space Invaders. As you probably expect, it's pretty much identical to the arcade game. But that's impressive because arcade perfection was difficult to come by back in those days, even when it's the SNES running a game from 1978. Okay, it's not 100% perfect. The most obvious thing is the sound, which isn't exactly right, but it's close enough. The parody mode from the arcade version is missing, but in its place you do get a nice 2-player versus mode, which is a nice little bonus. Graphics are spot on, and the gameplay is as well, making a neat little package for Space Invaders fans. And considering the generational gap, makes for a nice history lesson too. This game also found its way to the original Game Boy. Now you're probably looking at this and thinking, this isn't the same game, it's black and white, and of course it's black and white, it's on a Game Boy. But if you put it into a Super Game Boy, you got a nice little surprise. This little cartridge contained not only the Game Boy version of the game, but also the complete SNES version as well. Except for the versus mode, unfortunately. I don't know if this counts as 2 for the price of 1 since it's really the same game. Now we know the SNES version's pretty cool. What about the Game Boy version? Well, it's the same game more or less, just with smaller graphics. But otherwise, perfectly serviceable, and probably great for a long car journey. Well, if you can see the screen that is. The game also came to the PC Engine, and it's the same thing, but with anime girls inexplicably. SNES version was later brought to the Wii Virtual Console, and the PlayStation also saw a couple of versions. First Space Invaders 2000, followed by a strangely expanded budget re-release, known as Simple 1500 Series Volume 73 The Invaders Space Invaders 1500. Really rolls off the tongue that one, doesn't it? And really, it's the exact same game again. You get the same 4 choices. You've got the colour cocktail version, your black and white cocktail version, your cellophane version, and an even more accurate portrayal of the upright cabinet version, with a much better looking background. It's still not quite perfect, but what are you going to do? It's an old console. And the sounds have been improved so that they are absolutely spot on this time. The only real difference is that the aspect ratio is a bit different. Other than that, it's pretty much arcade perfect. Only took them 2 decades. There's also a versus mode, which is pretty much the same as the SNES version, but with better graphics and some ridiculously overhyped music. There's also a brand new single player mode called Time Attack, and it's pretty much what it says on the tin. You've got a set number of stages to complete, and the quicker you do it, the higher you score. You've also got a constant reminder of how accurate your shots are, for that little extra bonus score at the end. I quite like this version. Yeah, the 3D rendered graphics in the background look a bit cheesy, but the gradients over the aliens and the nice explosion effects really make it special. Also, it's got that same crazy music that's in versus mode. I approve. And finally, there's the 3D mode, which takes the classic formula we all know and love and makes it 3D, because everything had to be 3D in the 90s. And it's kind of a fun novelty, but I'd expect most people to play it once and then just ignore it. Fun to look at though. Now I've put off talking about this one for as long as possible, but we've got to address it sooner or later. The next game to enter the arcades after Space Invaders DX is Space Invaders 95, Attack of the Lunar Loonies. And this game is stupid. Yeah, you might infer that from the title of Lunar Loonies, but whereas DX was a new version of the original game, this game is a complete departure, I feel, from the Space Invaders formula thus far, to the extent that to me it doesn't really feel like a Space Invaders game at all. I mean, sure, the graphics are quite stunning really, even if the art style is bizarre beyond belief. And the music, it's okay, but after a while it really does your head in. You get a choice of several different characters, including a couple of anime girls, of course, as well as a dog, and a toilet, and oh, okay. Apparently I'm being that one then. Doesn't really give you enough time to look through them and make an informed decision. Not that it really makes much of a difference which one you pick. And it feels smooth and it's pretty fun to play. It just feels like it's being weird for the sake of being weird. And I can't say I'm too fond of that, to be honest. But I know some people really enjoy this game, so who am I to argue? This game didn't come to home consoles for almost 10 years after its initial release. But we'll get onto that later. Because after talking about one of my least favourite Space Invaders, now it's time to talk about the exact opposite. The imaginatively titled Space Invaders. It opens with a totally ridiculous and macho cutscene that has no bearing on the gameplay whatsoever. Looks cool though. Start a new game, and look, it's Space Invaders. in 3D! Because, as I've already said, everything needed to be 3D in the 90s. It's the law. On first glance it does seem to be an iteration of the classic rank and file stuff we're all used to from the old games, but on closer inspection it introduces some almost puzzle-like elements. Hitting 4 aliens of the same colour in a row grants you a special power-up. It means you can hit more aliens in a row. So it can be a nice challenge working out exactly the most efficient way to beat every stage. And there is a way. Well, for the most part anyway. But a lot of the stages do present you with a nice puzzle. I'm surprised this one hasn't been picked up by IGDQ yet. Make it happen, folks. There's a variety of planets that need defending, and each one comes with its own breed of alien. Come to think of it, it feels less like they're invading and more like you are. On a world tour of casual xenocide, why does nobody talk about these issues? Although I suppose it serves them right, they have been spending over 20 years destroying our moon, for crying out loud. Anyway, back to the point. Each type of alien has its own unique power-up, and there's quite a variety to be found. And some are a bit more efficient than others. Including the old stalwarts like the homing missile, the laser blaster that we last saw in Super Space Invaders. Here's one that just fires a massive cloud of acid, which is totally inefficient for the puzzle element. But which is more fun, solving a puzzle or mowing down a crapload of aliens? Know which one I'd rather do. My favourite is this one, where you just take your tank and slam it into a group of aliens. It's amazing that it can take all that, yet it can't take a single bullet. But don't worry, it's not like it's not an even fight. Each type of invader also has its own unique strategy. The 4 basic invaders do essentially the same thing. Move left and right and march downwards. As you'd expect from Space Invaders by this point. Sometimes they take 2 shots to beat, sometimes they split into 2 parts, sometimes they shoot downwards as soon as you hit them, sometimes they fire the shots at an angle, which is a real pain in the arse. This one's a real nightmare. As soon as you shoot it down it fires off a lot of projectiles. The one that always scared me as a kid was Jupiter, where they flew down and started firing their little lasers at you. The Nagoya attack unfortunately does not apply here. In case of emergency though, you can hit the UFOs that fly overhead. Remember those? And each one will give you one of a few passive power-ups, including the shield, which is ever useful, double shot, which is even more useful, and the time stop, again, a holdover from the old Super Space Invaders. Occasionally you'll also get these stages where you've got nothing but motherships to fight, again a little bit like Super Space Invaders but without the cows, and at the end of each planet you'll meet a boss, which by this point have become a bit of a staple of the series. I have to say the bosses sometimes feel a bit uninspired, especially this one, which I think they forgot to animate. It's worth mentioning that there's also a simultaneous 2-player mode. Again, we kinda come to expect that by this point. You also unlock the classic mode for completing the game, but it's a really bad port. I don't know how they managed to bungle this. It feels like an amateur's attempt in Scratch or something. Space Invaders was also released on the PlayStation and the N64, and those two had proper classic versions. But we've had plenty of classic versions of Space Invaders by this point, so I don't think we need another one. Overall, I really enjoy this game. It's the one that I grew up with, so I've got a bit of a nostalgic bias for it. And it's got to the point where I can get through it in about an hour. In fact, I managed to complete the whole game just recording footage for this video. And if that's not a ringing endorsement, then I don't know what is. The Game Boy Advance version is literally the same thing but in 2D, so we don't need to dwell on that too much. The Game Boy Color version on the other hand, well now you're asking the real questions. Despite the fact that this was released at the same time as the console and PC versions, this game is totally different in all but logo. Gone are the Match 4 style power-ups, though you still get some power-ups from UFOs, and in are the selectable ships. You get a choice from 3 different laser bases, each with unique stats, though the shield doesn't really matter too much since you can pick up shields from UFOs anyway. And because it's on such a tiny screen with such massive sprites, it's quite difficult to get your shots through the barriers so you can actually hit the invaders, making this a much more difficult game than perhaps it needs to be. In fact, overall it's kinda basic. The graphics are impressive, colourful, detailed, and the ship can do this little Street Fighter style dash, though because the screen's so small it's not really very effective. I suppose what do you expect for a handheld game? I just feel like there's a bit of missed potential here. PC version was so great, the Game Boy Color version is kinda lacking. Also the misspelled shield, 0 out of 10. A new generation, and a new overly narrative heavy Space Invaders game. We all know how popular the PlayStation 2 was. Heck, it's one of the biggest selling consoles of all time. So it made sense for Taito to capitalise on this new market with an entirely new Space Invaders game. And I know I said Lunar Loonies was a bit of a departure. That's nothing compared to this game. Space Invaders, Invasion Day. Eschewing the original undersea style designs for the aliens, in favour of a 50s B-movie aesthetic, Invasion Day forgets all about the moon and instead takes place in a gritty urban landscape, as you control one of 3 streetwise characters in a quest for... you know, I don't actually know. The opening cutscene doesn't really tell us very much, but it does so in the cheesiest possible way, which makes me think it's probably supposed to be kinda tongue-in-cheek. It's just unfortunate the gameplay doesn't really stand up. I know that Space Invaders is simplistic by its very nature, but the original games feel a lot more strategic. This one tends to consist of holding down the fire button and moving left and right a bit. It just doesn't really hold the attention for very long. It feels like a cheap third-person shooter more than anything. As well as your gun, you've got a couple of different abilities. Each character starts with 3 grenades, which clear the screen of enemies, or you can unleash your unique ability. It never really seemed to be very effective though when I tried it. Maybe I'm just doing it wrong. You can also do this dodge roll, but I have no idea how it's supposed to work. Sometimes you'll take a hit even though you're in mid-roll, so I don't know if the timing's supposed to be spot on or what. Also, if an enemy's really close up, you can just kill them by rolling into them. I know it's supposed to be low budget, but come on, I don't think we needed the Kirk Fu. And my god does it drag. Some of the aliens take a few shots to take down, which is okay, but it's no fun when they all feel like bullet sponges. It's even worse when you get to the second stage when you're confronted with, wait for it, zombies. Yes, really. In the US and Japan, this game was known as Space Raiders, which makes me wonder if it was even a Space Invaders game to begin with. Maybe it's based on the popular and nostalgic brand of crisps we have here in the UK, but somehow I doubt it. Even the 2-player mode isn't really enough to keep it from being a snorefest. It does have potential, but as it stands it's kind of mediocre. Besides, how are you going to repel a global invasion from one little backstreet in the middle of nowhere? "It has been too long," said the Taito executive, "since we had a collection of Space Invaders games for the consoles. And lo, it came to pass that Space Invaders / Kick Silver Anniversary Edition came to the arcades in 2003. It comes in an extremely nice cabinet and contains versions of both Space Invaders and Kicks, would you believe it? But if we started talking about Kicks, we'd be here all day. So let's just focus on our old friend, Space Invaders. Colour cocktail version. Is this all you get? 25 years of Space Invaders and this is all you get? Well, no. Because later in the arcades, as well as on PC and PS2, we got the ultimate collection, Space Invaders Anniversary. As a kid, I thought this collection was the bee's knees. It had everything. Space Invaders Upright, Space Invaders Colour Cocktail, Space Invaders Black and White Cocktail, Space Invaders Cellophane Cocktail, Space Invaders Part 2, Space Invaders Part 2 Cocktail, as well as a bunch of other games that seemed brand new at the time, and even the back of the box suggests so. But really, it's just a repackaged version of Space Invaders 1500, with a fancier front end. All that's different really is that the moon background on the upright cabinet is a little bit more accurate than before. Otherwise, you get the same stuff. For some reason there's an option to move back and forth in front of the cabinet like you'd want to stand 3 feet away from it while you're playing. The Versus mode actually has different rules in this version, and the graphics have been updated a little bit too, though it does lack the pumping music that was present in the PS1 version, which is a bit of a shame. And now there's this brand new doubles mode, which is the same Space Invaders we all know and love, but with 2 people. And the invaders keep respawning, so it's practically impossible to beat. Yeah, thanks guys. And we've got that 3D version again, and they made a few slight changes. For example, when you hit a UFO, your laser base gets a little upgrade. Not sure what the upgrades do exactly, but you get them nonetheless. Curiously, despite the fact that you're in a Space Invaders themed arcade, this compilation is missing 3 major games that we covered earlier in this episode. Return of the Invaders, Super Space Invaders, and Attack of the Lunar Loonies. Would have been nice to see them around because really all the games on offer are practically the same thing. And as an added extra bonus, you get to view some of the marketing and promotional material for some of the Space Invaders games over the years, as well as look at all the concept art from the first game. Look at the squids and the crabs. How exciting. You can also choose different background music from various Taito games, and I'm not really sure why you would. The Invader SE is perfectly fine, though it doesn't make any sense considering you're the only person in this arcade. And what a dingy little arcade it is too, smaller than my bedroom. And it literally only contains copies of Space Invaders, though that wasn't unheard of back in the day. There's also nobody at the desk. What kind of loners do they think players of this game are? Good grief. I have to say this is a great introduction to the Space Invaders franchise. If only for the fact that it's the cheapest and easiest to get running. You don't need to have a retro console and you don't need to have something that can play imports either. Just as long as you live in Europe, that is. Because the home version was never released in the US. Which makes a refreshing change, don't you think? But as I said, it would have been nice to see the missing arcade versions, and I would have liked to see some of the more historical games as well. Perhaps the Atari 2600 game should have made an appearance, and maybe they could have told us more about this weird moon-based Zeta that was released. Maybe they'll be part of an eventual 50th anniversary collection. But for the rest, we didn't need to wait that long at all, because Space Invaders had something of a renaissance on the handhelds after this, starting with Space Invaders Pocket for the PlayStation Portable. And as you'd expect, this is a collection of all the Space Invaders arcade games. You've got your Space Invaders Black and White Cocktail, you've got your Space Invaders Colour Cocktail, you've got your Cellophane Cocktail, and your Upright Mode, and your Part 2, and your Part 2 Cocktail, and Return of the Invaders. and you got Super Space Invaders, and you got Lunar Loonies. My prayers have been answered. It's nice to see all the arcade games collected on one disc. Some of the games have been tweaked a little bit for this handheld release. For example, in Super Space Invaders you can pick your stage, much like in the Master System version, and Lunar Loonies allows you to pick from a wider roster of characters, which were previously split between Player 1 and Player 2. Now that I can play as a cat, I'm feeling a bit more charitable towards the game. They've also been tweaked so that the score doesn't show up on the main screen, but rather in the border area, which cleans up the actual play area and makes it easier to focus on the game itself. Also, I must point out that Lunar Loonies has got new sound effects. Sounds like a flipping Rayman game now. You know, the more I play it, the more it's growing on me. Still freaks me out though. I also appreciate that the games haven't been stretched out like many other arcade game releases on the PSP. Sometimes I feel the need to take up every pixel on the screen and it just looks awful. But Space Invaders Pocket doesn't do that. Each game is rendered in 1:1 pixel ratio, with a nice border around it for good measure, and it looks perfect. And really, a handheld is the perfect platform for this sort of game. Great for quick play sessions on a train journey or a lunch break. And if you get bored of one game, well, you've got a few more to play. I'd say pick this one up if you get the chance. On the DS, Taito had had enough of these constant re-releases. Clearly they figured the Space Invaders franchise needed revolutionising a bit. So it's unfortunate they dumped out Space Invaders Revolution onto our dual-screen devices. Self-aggrandising titles aside, this game is really just Space Invaders with gimmicks. And yeah, I know you could say that about all the other previous titles, but at least they had something going for them other than, oh, it's Space Invaders but this time the invaders are a bit smaller. Oh, it's Space Invaders but this time they don't march quite as far. Oh, it's Space Invaders but sometimes they split into two. It's all so hackneyed, and it's just not much fun to play at all. You do at least get a classic version, but as you probably guessed, it's the colour cocktail version, and that's all you get. You can choose to play the classic game with nothing but the stylus, but as you can probably guess, that's a mistake you don't want to make. It's the equivalent of waggle controls on the Wii. Speaking of the touchscreen, it's really not put to much effect in the main game. Literally all you can do with it is shoot, which is stupid because you still got to use the D-pad to control your laser base. Yeah, all these things that look like buttons that you can press, all just window decoration. I have to wonder if this was originally a GBA game that they hastily retooled for the DS. All this game makes you feel is that you wish you were playing Super Space Invaders instead. Now I was looking forward to playing this next game, sounding fascinating. Space Invaders with rhythm action elements? Sounds like a winning combo to me. Well, I was excited for it, until I booted it up and found out it was by the same people as Revolution. All they did was drop the letter R, and we had Space Invaders Evolution. Or Galaxy Beat as it's known in Japan. And curiously, the first option in the menu is the classic mode. That doesn't bode well. And just by looking at it you can probably tell how imperfect this classic mode is. Considering we already had a spot on arcade conversion the year previous, I really don't think we needed this as well. One thing you might not be able to tell is that it's lacking the marching sound effect, i.e. one of the major selling points of the original game. Then you've got a matchup mode, which seems to be the same versus mode from Anniversary, but you have to play it on its side. You've got two players on the same PSP, and it's okay, but doesn't win any awards really. Once again, it had already been done better by a previous game. Now it's time for the main event. Future Mode. Speaking of self-aggrandizing titles, first thing that strikes me about this is the cutscene. Man, it is janky. I don't know if this is the worst CGI I've ever seen, but it's down there. Like, what's going on with this metal planet that then melts into a space station? And the spaceship itself is really kind of ugly. As for the game itself, it's really quite strange. Instead of scrolling left and right across the bottom of the screen, you actually seem to be in orbit, controlling a turret, or a laser base as it were, and shooting down a load of aliens that pose very little threat to you. Also, here's where the rhythm action stuff comes into play. I was wondering where that had gone. The X button fires a basic laser that you can fire as much as you like. Circle button fires a laser that you can only fire on the offbeat. It doesn't really seem to do anything other than that. And the triangle button charges up an attack that takes out a ton of invaders at once. And there's really no reason not to do this, so the other two attacks are a little bit pointless. Shooting down invaders builds up your item meter, bizarrely. You'd think that'd be energy or power or something, but no, item. And the more item you have, the more charged shots you can do, but you can get item by doing charged shots. So once again, there's no real reason to do anything else. While you're charging up a shot you can't move, but that doesn't really seem to be a problem because it's completely random whether you get hit or not. Half the time it looks like it's a direct hit and yet the bullet goes right through you. Other times the exact opposite happens. So the actual goal of this game is to build up your level so that you can take out the UFO in the background. Apparently you're supposed to use the circle attack and sort of snipe it, but I discovered that you can just use a charge shot and take it out instantly. So again, why would you do anything other? All I can really say about this game is that it is boring. There's no threat. The aliens do not do anything to antagonise you. They don't get closer, they don't fire any more often, they don't get faster, they don't even march around. The only thing that does anything is the UFO, and all that does is put down new invaders for you. Quite frankly, this lot seem too incompetent to mount a successful invasion, so I'd say just leave them to it. Probably end up destroying themselves anyway. Okay, maybe Renaissance was the wrong word. But it didn't take long for Taito to get their act together once again and make a proper handheld Space Invaders game for a new era. And its name?
Space Invaders Xtreme.
It starts out very traditionally. Your laser base can move left and right and fire, much like in the first game. And the aliens march from left to right and then back again, much like the first game. But what sets this one apart are its audio-visual effects. Already you can see that everything's colourful and wild and wacky and there's all sorts of crazy stuff happening in the background. Each bullet has a different effect, hitting invaders has a different effect, there's explosions everywhere, and everything that happens in time to that sweet, sweet background music, which makes this more of a rhythm action game than Evolution, ironically enough. Now it may seem quite shallow on the surface, but look a bit closer and you'll find that there's an incredibly in-depth scoring system, which even after looking it up still makes no sense to me. It involves shooting invaders in different patterns such as the same shape, the same colour, the same row, the same column, hitting UFOs at the right time. There's a thing called break that, from what I can tell, seems to come up at random. You can level up, though I don't see any indication thereof. I think the idea is to bombard you with text and visual effects, and I think it works extremely well, making for a really satisfying gaming experience. You just get points for everything you do. It's a fantastic feeling. Also, there's power-ups. Remember in the 99 game where hitting 4 of the same alien in a row granted you a special power-up? Well, the same thing happens in this. Power-ups aren't quite as varied, but they're still just as satisfying to use. You've got the old Super Space Invaders laser beam, as well as a broad shot, and a very satisfying bomb. Each one feels like it should be kinda situational, but really it's just about firing it and having fun. Also, different UFOs do different things. Sometimes they just trundle across like normal. Sometimes they drop in new invaders for you to shoot. Sometimes they themselves shoot at you, which I suppose makes sense. Some of them when shot give you a roulette mode, which is pretty self-explanatory. Some of them when shot take you to a bonus stage, each of which gives you a unique challenge that when completed takes you into fever mode. What is it with games and wanting you to be ill all the time? Whatever. Fever mode lets you loose on the stage with an infinite amount of a specific power-up, leaving you to rack up a massive score. And at the end that's what it's all about. After beating the boss at the end of the stage, you get a complete score breakdown, and you get to see where you place on the worldwide leaderboards. Yeah, I'm not even going to reach the top 100, am I? Let alone the top 10. It's a proper arcade game to the extent that it feels like it should be in the arcade itself. Actually reminds me of a lot of those crazy Japanese rhythm games. I don't even know where to begin with them. The game was initially only brought to PSP and DS, but later found its way to Xbox Live, and in 2018 it was ported to Steam, rather unexpectedly. It also got a DS exclusive sequel the following year. Xtreme 2 is essentially the same game again, but it makes more use of the top screen for fever mode and for bonus stages. And to this day it remains a DS exclusive, which is a bit of a shame. Nevertheless, Xtreme is really well worth a play and a fantastic evolution of the Space Invaders formula. More of an evolution than Evolution was, and more of a revolution than Revolution was, and more lunacy than... alright, maybe not. I will also mention that this is one of those rare games that works with a DS Rumble Pack, even if it is a dodgy knockoff like I've got. It's been a wild ride, but we're nearly at the end of this little Space Invaders themed tour. There are tons of games that I just didn't have time to look at in this one video, such as the PC Engine exclusive game, whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce, the Virtual Boy collection, yeah right. There was a game for the New One, an Ultraman themed game for the PlayStation, and thousands upon thousands of unofficial unlicensed games that would just take far too long to pick through, as well as all the TV games by companies like Jack's Pacific. There's Infinity Dream for the Xbox 360, which apparently has some crazy RPG elements. I'd like to try that one out someday. And the most recent new Space Invaders game is Space Invaders Frenzy, which I don't have any footage of, because it's an arcade exclusive, and it involves light guns, or pseudo light guns as it were. And now, we've just enough time to look at one last game. In every game we've played so far, the player's been in control of a laser base or tank or spaceship, or whatever, defending against an impending alien threat. This time the tables have turned, as the Space Invaders get even. But I'm not sure quite why they need to get even, since traditionally every Space Invaders game ends with a successful invasion. This game was exclusively released for WiiWare back in 2008, alongside 3 level packs, the cheeky beggars. Unfortunately, this means that unless you bought it when the Wii shop was still open, it's now impossible to play it these days, which is why it's so important for me to make a video of it. You take control of one of the ever-present UFOs, and you've got yourself a complement of 100 invaders. What do you do with those invaders? Well, you chuck them at stuff. That's pretty much the long and short of it. You've got several different attacks to use, including the homing shot, which pretty much does what it says on the tin. The drill, which makes them spin around for no particular good reason. The bomb, where they slam into the ground with a gigantic explosion. My favourite's probably the spring, where they just bounce around everywhere. And the idea is to fly around throwing your invaders at buildings and anyone else who would stand in your way. You get a specific objective at the start of the game, but really, there's a city below you. What are you going to do? Just going to leave it standing? You have 3 minutes to complete each mission, but you can get extra time by destroying buildings, enemy tanks, and landing in Stonehenge? Because for some reason Stonehenge is in the middle of the desert? Sometimes you'll be locked into a small arena by what they erroneously refer to as a tractor beam, and to get out you basically got to destroy something big, whether it's a tank or a helicopter or a specific building. Indeed, that's what basically all the objectives boil down to. There are also some secondary objectives, such as freeing invaders from giant vats of yellow goo, and abducting cows, because of course. If you take a hit you'll lose a bit of time and a few invaders, which means that your attacks become less effective. However, you can replenish your invaders by freeing them from the vats, or by unleashing your special attack, in which you call in the cavalry to clean up your mess for you. It's beyond me why they don't use this all the time. Maybe someone higher up wants to see how you handle a situation. And while you're flying around you'll intercept radio chatter from the human army. And they mention all the boring army stuff like being able to take a shot and we've got them on the run, etc, etc. But occasionally they'll say things that refer to the original game. For example, they reference the Nagoya attack technique, which is a nice touch. There are 7 missions to play, each with 3 levels in them. And the first one's called Get Even because that's the only one you got if you purchase the base game and no level packs. So for your 500 points you got 3 levels. Yeah, and you thought DLC was bad these days. Apparently this game was supposed to be released at retail, but they changed it to WiiWare at the last minute. There's very little evidence of that though, so I would take that with a pinch of salt. Playing this game actually reminds me of flying the UFO and Destroy All Humans 2. It's pretty cool, I think. Only problem with it is that every stage is basically the same thing. The first 2 levels in each mission are just flying around and doing UFO stuff, and the third one is a boss battle, where you face off against a giant tank with the power of the core cannon, which is actually the laser base. Don't know why they call it the core cannon. Maybe it's because it sounds a bit catchier. Who knows? I think what sets this game apart is its tone. Much like Invasion Day, it adopts a sort of B-movie aesthetic, but plays it in kind of a slapstick way. Invaders and explosions go off with onomatopoeic effects, and the dialogue can be quite entertaining, though there's only a few lines of it, so it can get grating after a while. It succeeds where that earlier PS2 game failed, and really it's quite a unique experience. Overall I think the game's quite fun, but it gets very repetitive. Like I said, each mission's kind of the same thing, and while they'll occasionally change things up by having wind and weather and sometimes they'll funnel you down a specific corridor, essentially all you're doing is throwing your invaders at things and destroying them. And even if it is a bit repetitive, it's satisfying, and if you do get the chance, I'd say it's worth a go. Not worth 2,000 points though. Not every game can claim to have aged as well as Space Invaders, but then again not every game's 40 years old either. If there's a game around today that's still being played 40 years in the future, I'll be very surprised. It may be old and it may be basic, but Space Invaders has demonstrated a fantastic staying power. There's been some great games in the series, there's been some crap games in the series, and on average it's not had the best of runs really. But because that first game captured the imaginations of so many people around the world, it's managed to endure, and it's left one hell of a legacy. It's not for nothing that it's become the de facto symbol of gaming. That Middle Invaders become such a cultural icon that anybody will recognise it as video games, even if they don't necessarily identify it as Space Invaders. And so many games today can track the lineage back to it. John Carmack stated that the game had an influence on him when he was young, which probably means it's responsible for Doom, and we all know how groundbreaking that game was. I imagine people will still be playing Space Invaders well into 2078 and beyond, despite what the DOS version of Super Space Invaders claims. And if we ever get attacked by intergalactic terrorists, we've got a whole generation of people who'll know exactly what to do.